Hey guys, this is Mark, and we'll start up where we left off last week. Let me close the screen here. Um, we're going to finish up performance and limitations today, and aeromedical. Um, so last week we were talking about the glide ratio um, and looking at the glider polar to see how far a glider would glide in still air, um, and what a glide ratio meant. And so we looked at best glide, we looked at minimum sink, we looked at what to do if you got a headwind, um, tailwind, crosswind, and we left off here when you got lift and sink. So um, get my little arrow out here. So when we talk about speed to fly, well, if we're in lift, we're going to fly minimum sink speed. We can use that to go how high? Well, how high will it take us? Or we might use it to go somewhere, meaning we might use it to thermal up somewhere, say at one point on our ridge in Hood River, and tried to get to the other side or another point on the ridge. Um, so, okay. Now, if we're in sync, okay, so here's where we got to start doing something. We're already sinking 100 to 300 feet a minute on average, right? So in this example, the glider they gave us here, if you remember, it's a 23-to-1 glide ratio, which is similar to Big Orange. So if we're already sinking 1.6 knots and we're losing 3 knots, well, that's 4.6 knots. So if we divide that into our 55 knots, now we're getting 12-to-1, and and we're coming down fast. So if we're at the notch and we're 2,000 feet, um, we're going to get about 4 miles. And the airport, here's the ridge over here on the little part of the chart I dropped into your slide here, and here's the airport. I drew a line, coordinates from what would approximately be the notch to our initial point, or to the high school, the beginning of your downwind, is 3 miles. So that might work out. That might work out in that, well, actually, that would be low. If we're 2,000 feet here and we want to get over here, we prefer to be 1,000 foot over the beginning of our pattern. This might be a situation where you'd have to come in, and we haven't even really talked about do we have any headwind yet. So anyway, so now we're going to look at, well, what is our new best glide, speed to fly, right? So we're sinking, so we want to be flying out of this. So the line gets displaced, and 3 points here. And for this particular glider, we see that the speed to fly with our line tangent to the polar is 72 knots, giving us a little bit better sink rate there, maybe 2.5 knots instead of our 4.6. It is interesting to notice too that this 3 knots of sink is comparable to like a 40-knot headwind, right? So that's kind of interesting. Now, a rule of thumb, because we're obviously, some of this stuff you're not going to be doing in the cockpit especially right away. A rule of thumb is to add 5 knots to your best L over D for each knot of sink. And remember, this glider here, best L over D, or your best glide, was 55 knots. And so if we're 1, 2, 3 knots of sink, we add 5 knots, that would get us 55, 60, 65, 70. So we're close. If we cruise 70 without doing any major math, like the quick in the head math up here, we'd be doing okay and get back to the field safe if we needed to. Now, there's some other ways to, this is a little bit more advanced, but I just wanted to mention it because awareness is key, right? McCready speed rings are, and I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. Well, I'll do it now. The McCready speed ring. Here's a McCready speed ring. This is developed to go fit over your variometer, and then you would just click this to, like in that case, in that particular case, you would click the white arrow to 3 knots of sync, and then whatever the speed's written on here is what you would fly. And so here, these ones are calibrated for your glider, and they do that already. I snagged these slides from a presentation, a webinar from the Soaring Society of America that just happened with John Cochran. He didn't have these on here, but this was just kind of some samples of how you start to look at McCready speeds. This is nothing for you to know. Just know that it's kind of out, well, immediately know for your private now, but just know that they're out there. And this is out there. I want to go back one slide here. In that, starting out, your main 3 speeds to really know are just your minimum sync, your best glide, and then some type of speed to fly to cut through sync or wind, which is really using a rule of thumb, and such as this case is adding 5 knots to each knot of sync, or when you're cutting through wind, adding at least half the headwind. So if you're flying 55 is your best glide. Well, actually, Big Orange, the 233, best glide is 50. So if it's 20 knot headwind, then you're going to at least add 60. You probably will need to add more. Okay, so starting out, main 3 speeds, and yeah, you need to know your, look down here at 3 speeds, minimum sync. You need to know your stall speed, but really if you're not really going below your minimum sync, then you're not going to hit your stall speed. Okay. Here was just also another slide I snagged from his, showing the polar on here, and if you were in 2 knots of lift, where it would give you a speed, and if you were in a certain amount of sync, they also use the McCready speed ring kind of as like a rescue. If you're in like super amount of sync, you crank it up, and then you go through the sync really quickly. And again, the last slide I think I took from John Cochran's presentation. I found this slide really interesting. Again, this is looking ahead at your soaring career, but this gets more into racing. But when the McCready mathematics really got into it, what they really proved was when you were racing, if you were at 1,000 feet, you took no lower than 1 knot, and then as you moved up to about 2,000 feet, you didn't stop for anything lower than 2 knots of lift, and at 3,000 feet, anything for 3 knots of lift, and then it went up from there. So this is really a racing thing, but I just think I was fascinated by such a high level of math and kind of how simple it showed us down at the bottom. Now, at your level, if you're at 2,000 feet, then you're out away from the airfield, you're going to be looking for a field to come in and land. But that's something we'll discuss more next week with emergency procedures. Just looking ahead a little bit there for you. Okay, now if we get into the questions, right? So here's the FAA questions for the FAA written. Here's the graph, 54. How many feet will the glider sink in 1 statute mile at 53 miles per hour in still air? So here they're in statute miles. And so this one's more of a simple one. Your statute miles 5,280. Divide that by 30.9, and you get the 171 feet. And so the chart tells you it right here. I mean, you can look down here and look up and find that, but the chart already tells you what its best L over D is. Okay. All right. So the next one, how many feet will a sailplane sink in 15 nautical miles if its lift drag ratio is 22 to 1? Okay, well, we'll divide the 15 by 6,000. In a lot of these cases, they're just asking you to round because the nautical miles, really 6,000. So that gives you 90,000 feet. It's 90,000 divided by 22 gives you 490. And there it rounds up to 4,100 feet. Let's see, what minimum upward current must a glider encounter to maintain altitude? At least 2 feet per second, the same as the glider's sink rate, the same as the adjacent down currents. And that's going to have to be B, the same as the glider's sink rate. All right. A sailplane has a glide ratio of 30 to 1. How many nautical miles will the glider travel while losing 2,000 feet? All right, so over 2,000 feet times its glide ratio, it's going to go 60,000 feet. 60,000 divided by this 6,000 for each nautical mile is 10 nautical miles. Okay, the next one. What corrective action should be taken if while thermaling at minimum sink speed in turbulent air, the left wing drops while turning to the left? Would you apply more opposite right aileron pressure than opposite right rudder pressure to counteract the overbanking tendency? B, would you apply opposite right rudder pressure to slow the rate of turn? Or C, lower the nose before applying right aileron pressure? All right, if you said C, lower the nose before applying right aileron pressure. So the corrective action here, as you're thermaling in turbulent air, and the left wing drops, so you can lower the nose, and then if you would need to, you could apply some right rudder pressure to counteract that if you needed to. Okay, here is our 233 polar. Okay, so now it's kind of a active polar, so let's break it down here. So here, this tight dotted line is the solo polar. Okay, so here's your best L over D for solo. And in the book, it tells you best gliding speed L over D 23 to 1 at 45 miles per hour, one place. So if we look at the line and go straight down, this is supposed to be 45 miles per hour here. Now, the solid line here is two place at 1,040 pounds. Okay. And this other one is, and it's at 50, and two place at 1080, so at max or gross weight. So anyway, you can see they coincide here with the best gliding speed at 50 miles per hour for both the front and back seat of the 233 filled. Okay, now the minimum sink speeds are down here. So minimum sinking speed, 38 miles per hour for one place or for one person. is right here, okay? And the minimum sinking speed, 42 miles per hour for 2 place, 3.1, 42 miles per hour. To me, it looks like it's the way that it's drawn here proves that it's higher. Interesting. Anyway, so here's the polar, and here's the flight speeds out of the glider POH, and we'll need those coming up. So for both of us, because that's what we'll be looking at training, we'll be starting with 50. Okay, so here is just a few segments out of the POH. Flight limit speeds: aero tow 98 miles per hour. Aerobatics, we won't be doing any aerobatics in the 233. Stalls, it tells you here 31 miles per hour at solo and 34 dual. Buffeting occurs before the stall, and it's true that 233 does give you a lot of warning before it's going to stall. Some different things in here. Here is the tells you you can spin it, and this is the one thing that you could do with you and an instructor and not have to wear parachutes, whereas on aerobatics, remember 91-307, if you intentionally pitch up pitch more than 30 degrees or bank more than 60 degrees for a maneuver, that you have to be wearing parachutes. Let's see here. Useful load, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then here it gets into, I love this about the Schweitzer book, just how it talks about, I mean, it gives you some hints on how to do thermaling. But here, the stalling speed, level flight for solo, of course, we talked about that, 31 and 33 for dual. And if you're in a 30-degree bank, so now you got a little bit of load on there, you're at 33.5 miles per hour. So we talked about how you would have to increase the speed because of the load, and 35.5 for the dual. Shows you the speeds. Buffeting will occur. Okay, so a few more things. Talks about spoilers. It is unsafe, however, to make an approach with dive brakes open in the speed range of 36 to 43 miles per hour, as the rate of descent is so great that a proper flare out for landing cannot be made. Essentially, you could just have a hard landing here. And we'll talk about that actually out on the field. But just kind of pointing these out, if you haven't gotten into to read the 233 manual yet, that it just talks about pattern, touchdown, and how to handle the plane, which is good to read the entire POH. Okay, so here we are. Effects of wing loading and the best glide speeds. So maximum drag ratio, remember, for a glider does not change when the wing loading is changed. It's the speed at which it occurs. Because remember, we've talked about this in the aerodynamics section, the best L over D ratio, that it corresponds to that very specific angle of attack. Now, if the wing loading's increased and the angle of attack is held constant, then the airspeed must be increased to create more lift at that angle of attack, which was what those speeds were just showing. And we're going to drive that point home here more. Lift increases at the square of the airspeed. So there's our rule. Airspeed must increase by the square root of the increase of the wing loading. So our glider, best L over D, let's say we got it at 1,000 pounds and we're flying 55 knots, and we roll into a 45-degree bank. And from our charts, we saw that the load factor on a 45-degree bank is 1.4. So now we're weighing 1,400 pounds. So if we take the square root of that, which ends up being this 1.18, and we multiply that by 55, we get 65 knots. So that's what in that in the now if we applied this same thing to Big Orange, so the best glide with 2 people, do you remember what the speed is? So it would be 50, and then if we did a 45-degree bank, what speed would we need? Basically, the square root of 1.4, and then a 60-degree bank is 2, so the square root of 2, multiply those by that to get the airspeed that we would need. And handy, here we go, on the next, have that on the next slide here. So Big Orange, 2 people, 50 miles per hour, best glide. If we're going to roll into a 45-degree bank, we need to increase our speed to 59. And if we're going to do a 60-degree bank, we need to do 71. Now the sink rate will also increase at these same rate increases. So at the same square root. And then the same effect with wing loading on minimum sink speed. So if the same rules apply across the board, which we could make a card for, and we do have a card for, of all the speeds that you could use as a cheat sheet in the cockpit. Now, I found this, I like this slide discussing altitude loss during a turn, and this is a Grobe 103, so a nice nice tandem glider. So again, product of minimum sink, or the load factor, and time required to complete the turn. So which sink rate and turn rate increase with increasing bank angle. In this particular graph, they learned that a 45-degree angle bank, they have the minimum amount of altitude loss, 70 feet, up to about a little less than a 40 and a little more than a 50. They don't lose too much more, but you start getting, it starts falling off quickly, being less steep or more steep. So when you're out there thermaling, we're going to be aiming for at least those 45-degree banks and angles, and also that's a maneuver that you will all have to do well to pass the actual practical test with the FAA examiner. Okay. Here's our flight envelope. If you've gone and looked at the book, the POH for the 233, you've seen that in here. Okay, so here we are, 1G, and you can see speeds are down here, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. So as we're flying and maneuvering, we're within this window of safety between positive G load and negative G load, negative 2.56, positive 4.67. So, and this glider actually, the 233 actually comes built with a whole another 1.5 times this load factor, kind of like an insurance, if you will, and that's for variances in materials and the way that it's built. But up to 65 miles per hour here, it can withstand quite a bit, and so its VA, or what we would say maneuvering speed, is at 65. So if you're up here in 70 or 80 and you're getting into turbulent air, you're going to need to pull back to 65 here. maintain straight and level, so you don't bend any of the control surfaces. Here at 100, or 98 really, is our red line, so we don't want to exceed this speed here. Okay, what effect would gust and turbulence have on the load factor of a glider with changes in airspeed? Load factor decreases as airspeed increases. Load factor increases as airspeed increases. C, load factor increases as airspeed decreases. And that's going to be B. Load factor is definitely going to increase as airspeed increases, especially in turbulence and gust. All right, weight and balance. So we talked about weight and balance in the aerodynamic part, and here we're getting into more actually doing it. So again, this affects our longitudinal stability for our gliders, and if the weight and balance is too far aft, then that can be dangerously unstable for a glider pilot, and if they're too far forward, the glider pilot may not have enough weight on the tail to actually flare it and land it in a safe manner, meaning they would just thump it into the front right here, which would not be good for the glider, but definitely not good for you, who we're more concerned about. So now, acceptable CG ranges are determined by the manufacturer. So basically, we're given the rules and we have to adhere to it. We can do lots of calculations, and, but as long as we're staying within the range, then we're good to go. Now, for gliders, a lot of times it's pretty simple. The flight manual or the POH gives us a chart, or there's placards on the instrument panel that we can use to stay in range, or you can calculate the moments in the arms. So those are some new terms that we may be talking about. And a lot of times when you get into flying power planes, there's a lot more calculations, but also a lot of that stuff gets put into spreadsheets now. Okay, so again, new terms. All right, so if we look at the glider down here, a lot of times we have a datum. Well, we always have a datum, and that's where you measure any arm from, or the distance. So a pilot here, the pilot's weight and distance from this datum is going to have a moment on the CG, right? Because if, let's say, the CG's here, this plane can, I always think about the CG rotating around, the airplane rotating around the CG. And so, and then rear seat, that's where I'd be sitting, and my weight and my distance, it has a moment. Okay, and all right, and the arm, or the distance. Now let's see here, where do I go? So basically, we're gonna take all these weights, meaning your weight and my weight and the empty glider weight, multiply those times the arms, which is the distance, and those give us moments. And we'll take that total moment divided by the total weight, and that'll give us the CG location. And as long as that location is within the range, we're good to go. If it's out of the range, we've got to make some adjustments. Okay. All right. So here is a picture of R233, and Now that datum on this one is actually put in between where the student and the instructor sit. Doesn't mean anything, they just do it differently. Okay. All right. And that's just a picture. That's just a picture of in the book where they talk about doing the balance calculations. And here is a sample of out of the 233 manual. So sailplane empty weight 612 pounds. The arm or the distance from the datum to the CG uh, to the CG 9612. So you multiply those two and you get the moment. And they're just doing an example here. Front pilot weight 170 pounds times the arm, that's a moment. Rear pilot weight uh, times the arm, which is the distance to the rear pilot seat, gives you a moment. And they didn't use the ballast for, okay. And then, so here's your total moment, here's your total weight. And so they multiplied that, that gave them 83.13. And this CG is between the limits of station 78.2 and 86.10. So that means you're within weight and balance. Okay. And now here's a chart. You can do it the chart way. All right. So up this side, we have the front seat passenger in pounds and the rear seat passenger in pounds. Okay. And so if we go to give Chuck a lesson today, and Chuck weighs, let's say, 160 here somewhere, and and so he would come out to here, and I'm about 150. So we would be within weight and balance of this chart. Okay, if you end up like over here, somewhere down here, out here, then you're not within weight and balance. Okay. All right. We'll go through a few of the weight and balance FAA questions. This is kind of a easy one to throw at you here. A pilot plans to fly solo in the front seat of a two-place glider, which displays the following placards on the instrument panel. Minimum pilot weight, 135 pounds. Maximum pilot weight, 220 pounds. Note, seat ballast should be used as necessary. The recommended towing speed for all tows is 55 to 65 knots. What action should be taken if the pilot's weight is 125 pounds? 125 pounds. Minimum pilot weight, 135 pounds. So we need 10 pounds. Add 10 pounds of seat ballast to the rear seat. Nope. Add 10 pounds of seat ballast. Yep. Add 45 pounds of seat ballast to obtain the average pilot weight of, yeah, whenever you see stuff like that, you know it's wrong. Okay, there it is. So add 10 pounds of seat ballast. Okay. Which items are included in the empty weight in aircraft? Okay, so I threw this question in there just because every once in a while, you know, you're going to get, for some reason, you're going to get a question that pertains to a power plane. A, unusable fuel and undrainable oil is your answer. B, only the airframe, power plant, and optional equipment. Full fuel tanks and engine oil to the capacity. Unusable fuel and undrainable oil adds to the weight of all this here, or adds to the weight of the plane. So those are always used. And hopefully you don't see any of those on your FAA test, but they still get thrown at glider pilots. Okay, all right, here's one. I kind of broke the math out so it was easy to follow, but you'll see this one. All right, how is the CG affected if radio and oxygen equipment weighing 35 pounds is added at station 43 43.8, right? Okay, so here, 43.8, the guy sitting here is we're gonna put a radio and some oxygen equipment at the station. And so we're gonna change this, we're gonna include this, we're gonna make this moment heavier. So it's gonna definitely shift the CG forward here, okay? And it's asking how is the CG affected. The glider weighs 945 pounds with a moment of 78,000 poundages prior to adding the equipment. All right, so I came down here, and I always just kind of like to just do the simple math. The weight's 945 times the distance 9647 gives me the moment of the empty weight of the plane, 82.35 plus, so here's 35 times 43.87, and gives you that moment. So here's the equipment, that moment, and then you divide those, divide the total moment by the total weight, 81,158. And then the thing you would have had to do before is divide the, oh, I already did that here. So you would need to know what the current CG was, right? So divide the 78,000 by 945, right? The moment by the weight before you added the equipment. So here's the 82,539, and you can see, yep, definitely shifted forward 81,158. So we would come over here and find the answer. CG shifts, it's definitely not shifting aft, right? And it's within limits. So this one says out of limits, it's within limits. It's B. There we go. Okay, so in weather, we talked about this. I just kind of threw this in there to remind us, since we are talking about performance of aircraft, right? And on those hot, humid days, remember, as we go up in the atmosphere, the air gets thinner, and on those hot, humid days or super cold days, you could get colder pressure, and the plane performs even better. So the temperature, the weather outside definitely plays a major aspect on the performance of your airplane. Um, and so I just wanted to review that with you as far as performance. And generally, the higher up, the lesser the pressure, the lesser the performance out of the airplane. The lower or the pressure, the higher the pressure, the better performing airplane. In this particular example, let's see, determine the density altitude for these conditions. So we got an altimeter setting of 30.35, a runway temperature at 25, and an airport elevation of 3,894 feet. So first we're going to start over here with the altimeter setting, and it was 30.35. Okay, so it's right here in the middle. The FAA likes to know that you can extrapolate. So you're basically needing to find the number right between here. Just eyeballing it, you could guess 348, 440. You're going to be somewhere close to 400. You can always, what I did right here for you was add the two, divide them by 2, and get the average, 394, right? So that's an extrapolation of saying we're going to take 394 feet and we're going to add that to the airport elevation of 389 feet and use 4,288 feet. Okay, and then you're going to come here to 2.5 or 25, yep, degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to go up to 4,200, so about here, 4,300, and come across, and we're going to say our density altitude is at 2,000 feet, so that's a high pressure day, so airplanes should be performing well. Or the glider should be performing well. Okay, 2,000 feet. All right. Now, here's the card that we're going to give you for Big Orange or 2964 Hotel, the 233. I'm going to actually revamp this card some. But you can see on it that it's got your dual, so your best L over D at 50, at 45 degrees, at 60-degree banks, right? Minimum sink, 42, 50 at 45-degree bank, 60 miles per hour at 60-degree bank. Stalls, 33 straight and level, 39 at 45-degree bank, and 47 at 60. So this cheat sheet's made for you. It's got takeoff checklist, landing checklist, some other tidbits on here. It's made to flip over, to fold over, and then you got your weight and balance on your back, which is kind of nice. Okay, so I'm gonna go into the aeromedical. Is there any questions? Haven't seen anybody pop up with any questions yet. Okay, aeromedical issues. All right, so this is task E, and this is really the last task of the oral portion that that the PTS really ask you to go through. Whereas next week we're gonna talk about regulations and charts and cross country stuff, and so examiner will still sit down and ask you about all those things in the oral portion of your exam, but it's not in the PTS in that way. It's more for the flying portion, but it's kind of hard to test somebody in a reasonable manner while you're flying doing it. So anyway, aeromedical. Okay, so symptoms, causes, effects, and correlation action of at least 3 of the following. So the examiner is going to go through and ask you about at least 3 of these. And I'll try to point out where the ones they tend to ask about a lot. Okay, so here we are. We're back to our PAVE, and this is definitely PAVE. Pilot, aircraft, environment, external forces. So here we are at I'm safe. So this is the pinnacle of the I'm safe. Remember, the I is illness, the M is medications. Are you on any medications that would be causing you drowsiness that or impair your ability to make good piloting decisions? S is for stress. We all carry a reasonable amount of stress, but are you overly stressed where it's just probably not a good idea to go flying today? The A is for alcohol. No alcohol within 8 hours. Fatigue. Did you get a good night's sleep last night, or are you overly fatigued? And then the E's for eating, emotion, energy. Do you have you got a little something on in your belly to give you some glucose to make the flight? Okay, so that's the checklist that they want to hear. Um, so I just threw this question in there. Prior to becoming certified as a private pilot with a glider rating, the pilot must have in his or her possession what type of medical? A statement from a designated medical examiner, a third-class medical certificate. A medical certificate is not required, and it is not required. Just want to make sure everybody remembers that. Okay, so let's start out with a few things they like to talk about. Here's one that they do like: hypoxia. Um, it's just a lack. It's a lack of oxygen, um, and symptoms from hypoxia can be euphoria. You can notice your fingers turning blue, which is the cyanosis, headaches, visual impairment. You can get some. The P in there is peripheral neuropathy for tingling in your fingers or toes, numbness, um, and hypoxia has a real ability to um, uh, affect a pilot's mental and physical capabilities as far as piloting an airplane. Um, Interesting enough is that your eyes can start being affected above 5,000 feet. Many of the soaring pilots do start to use it at above 5,000 feet to prevent hypoxia. Um, Things that can exacerbate hypoxia: medication, smoking, alcoholism, emotional stress, increasing age can make one more susceptible to hypoxia. At lower altitudes, I should preface all these things with. Um, the remedy to hypoxia is just get lower, flying lower, or using oxygen. Um, there's been time studies done, such as time of useful consciousness, and if you were at 20,000 feet and you run out of your oxygen tank runs out in your glider, um, you have about 30 minutes worth of useful consciousness time. But at that point, you already could be um, pretty severely affected or hypoxic. And so, um, if you're going to go above the 14,000 feet, 12,000 feet, 500 feet, um, using oxygen is highly, highly suggested. In the club, we're getting an oxygen station, and a lot of our planes are outfitted for oxygen. Hyperventilation. So this is loss of carbon dioxide. It's usually brought on by stress, by some type of rapid breathing, and symptoms are lightheadedness, feeling of suffocation. It's usually more a panicky type of situation. So the remedy is to breathe slower, or talk or sing or count out loud. With this type of situation, if you ever find yourself in this situation, relax, count to 10 out loud, fly straight and level, and then get to the airport. Middle ear. Middle ear stuff. Okay, so when they want to talk about middle ear, what they're usually want to talk about is the pressure changes as you go up or down. So pain or reduction in hearing due to trapped air in your ear or upon ascent or descent. So, we've got our eardrum here and we got our eustachian tubes. So when we're on the ground and we're at our static pressure, just like our airplane, we're all neutralized. And when we go up, this air in here has a higher pressure, so it bulges out. When we come back, this pressure is lower and this is higher, and so this bulges in. So you can generally kind of relieve this by just gently holding your nose and blowing. You can use some medication, some non-drowsy antihistamines, loratadine or cetirizine. Also, the brand names, I think, for the loratadine is Claritin, and cetirizine Zyrtec. Phenylephrine or pseudoephedrine could be used, but These are a no-no. If you have high blood pressure, you'd have to talk to your doctor. Um, no Benadryl. Uh, it is an antihistamine, but it'll cause drowsiness, and so it's actually on an FAA list for no flying for 40 hours. Now, sinus problems, this is the one that I think get people a little bit more than the middle ear stuff. I get middle ear stuff all the time. I just blow it out, and no big deal. But the sinus problems, this can be excruciating for people. Um, if you're overproducing snot, or your mucous membranes are having a run with you that day, that might it's probably best just to not fly. So, you know, colds, if you got a cold and everything, that's good time for these to start overproducing. And what happens, you go up, same thing, pressure, this all gets stuck in here, and that's just very painful. Now you can clear this up. This is where phenylephrine and pseudoephedrine work really well. And I've seen uh, students go get some of that and then be able to fly just fine. But again, if you have high blood pressure issues, I would stay away from this stuff. Loratadine and cetirizine may be able to work here, maybe not. But again, no Benadryl. But actually, if you're not going to fly, take the Benadryl in this situation. You'll be drowsy for a couple days, but you'll feel better. All right. Spatial disorientation. All right, so here where we're really heading to is kind of staying out of clouds, because our vision, so what our eyes are telling our brain, kinesthetically, what our muscles, what we call seat of the pants flying, what our butt is telling our brain, and what our vestibular system, or the semicircular canals, these have a yaw. These, just like our airplane, can tell if we're yawing or pitching or banking. And if you go into a cloud, if you go into the clouds, like, this system disconnects, your vision disconnects, and all you have is your kinesthetic, or your butt. And you could end up basically in a bank, and then you think you're just you or a diving bank, and you think you're just turning, and then you're pulling back and you're loading up the glider, and then it breaks apart. So the big thing here is, don't fly into clouds, heavy G clouds, right? You need the gyro system to fly into clouds. You need the attitude indicator, the heading indicator, the turn indicator. So now, with that being said, get careful about getting trapped above clouds. And that doesn't happen often, just from the nature of students just don't wander off that far. But what do you do if you do get trapped above clouds? I mean, in that situation, we have a rule called aviate, navigate, communicate. So the first thing you do is stay calm and you fly the plane. If you got some type of GPS system, you can kind of stick close to your airfield and wait for some type of hole. Or if you know you're high and there's no hole, you could do a letdown through. Kind of boxing myself in a corner here by talking about that, but I would talk more one-on-one with your instructor about that situation. I mean, there's lots to do. I mean, staying up, you can communicate with um, aviate, navigate, communicate. So you can, if you have your radio, then you can ask for help with ATC. All right. Anyway, now the other place people get into trouble here with spatial disorientation is circling on a hot day. Or you're out thermaling, you're you're doing those 45-degree banks, and you're circling, and you get dehydrated. Um, you could get dizzy, you could get nauseated. Um, big thing to do is straight and level, relax for a bit, and then come back to the airport. All right, so motion sickness is a little bit kind of tied in with spatial disorientation. There's usually something going on with the vision, the kinesthetic, the vestibular, neuro, or the brain component that is not wanting, that got tripped up somewhere, kind of like, when you're sitting there with a car and another car moves and you think you're moving. That's usually the similar effect, except that this elicits a serotonin response, which generally means that you want to throw up. Um, so other symptoms of it: perspiration, dizziness, or basically nausea caused by the ride. Um, if it might not be you that's getting motion sickness, but you're a passenger that you're given a ride with, or a friend. So stay alert for your passengers. If they get quiet, it's time to get them back to the airport. Check in with them when you're giving them a flight. Hey, how's it going up there? If you're not having a good time, let me know. We'll go land. And let's see here. The remedies for them is feet on the floor, stare at a single object, open the air vents, have a six-sack, loosen clothing. For pilots, don't use the OTC motion sickness meds. They can cause drowsiness. You could use some ginger chews, but usually with some time and small, short flights, this tends to go away. All right, dehydration. Losing more H2O than your intake. So losing more water than you're taking in is usually the cause of dehydration. Fatigue, dizziness, weakness, nausea, tingling of your fingers, abdominal cramps, of course, thirst. Um, this can also impair your mental and physical performance. It can be caused by breathing dry bottled oxygen, sweating from exertion, stress, high temperatures, high winds. So to me, this is probably one of the bigger things that we could kind of see on the field. Um, it's hot out there. We're pushing gliders around. Um, there's high winds. I see a lot of people running around the airfield not with uh, windbreakers on and things like that. So when you're out there on the glider field, really, uh, even though it seems like a nice day, maybe down in the city or something, you get up there and the airfield just always seems to be full of wind, and it just makes you fatigued and dehydrated, beats it out of you. So make sure you come prepared for the elements. You can always take layers off. So what's of course the remedy? H2O. Or water. Keep a windbreaker at the field, even on hot days. Um, what if you land out, right? So it's always good to have some water with you in your glider, but maybe even best to have a little water and a great communication device. Um, Mike Bamberg, our your pilot examiner that will give you the FAA test, he likes to ask this great test, or um, what do you need when you land out? He likes to ask this question a lot because he has this rule of three. And I think if I remember it right, it goes hypothermia can occur in less than 3 hours, and a person can survive 3 days without water, and they can survive 3 weeks without food. Um, it's one of these things he likes to just, I think, propose on you so that you're thinking about emergency situations. So I think, though, if you're not needing to use the Johnny on the spot on the field within 3 hours, you're not drinking enough water. Need of use is preferred at every 2 hours while out in the sun. So Make sure you're bringing lots of water. Heat stroke. Okay. So obviously this is a medical emergency. So if you see any of your glider mates red, flush-skinned, probably ought to get them some water and get them out of the sun, have them relax. If they got a high temperature, we're going to be getting them to the ED right away. That's a seizure risk. Haven't seen this out on the airfield, but they do like once. I don't, this isn't one that they could ask you about it, but it's not one that I hear often. It's caused by high temps, lack of body fluids, overexposure to elements. Um, but it is easy to do that out at the glider port, as I was just talking about dehydration. And then sunburn, cover up out there. Use block. Skin cancer is real. Use hats. Use shirts. Alcohol and drugs. Medications that you need to be on or not. Talk with your doctor and if it's okay to fly with them or not. Any medications that cause drowsiness, avoid those. Um, Class 1, we talked about the law. No alcohol within 8 hours of flight, or a blood alcohol level of 0.04. Scuba diving. So here's a situation where people that like to scuba dive and go flying, that what can happen is they can have an excessive amount of nitrogen in their body, and so they just need to wait 12 to 24 hours to get rid of it. Or if they're in the air, it could cause a situation called the bends, which would be an in-flight medical emergency. It's recommended that if they've done a dive, that they wait 12 hours if they're only going to fly up to a pressurized altitude of 8,000 feet, and 24 hours after a dive, if it required a controlled ascent. And so that is the section on scuba diving and nitrogen. Couple more slides here. We got medical certificates. Remember, not required for glider from FAR 6123. Now, I put this back here, the medical cliff notes, this slide here. Put this in here for you because just for taking the FAA written, they still will ask some of these questions. And so you've got first class, second class, and third class. If we start at the bottom here, if we start at the bottom and we look at third class, if a pilot's under the age of 40, a third class medical expires the 60th month or 5 years after the month of date of examination shown on the medical certificate. If they're over the age of 40, it expires 24 months, right? Okay, so now if a pilot gets a second class medical, it expires at any age 12 months after. So if a guy's 25 and he gets a second class medical, it expires after a year, but then he has a third class medical for 4 years. Just because there could be some questions on this, right? So now if the guy's 45 and he gets a second class medical, after a year it becomes a third class medical, but that medical is only good for 1 year. And then as we move up to the first class medical, it's the same thing, right? So if the guy's under age 40, it expires 12 months after, right? So if a guy's 30 years old, he gets a first class medical, it's good for 1 year. and then it goes to third class medical. Okay. And the same for, if they're over 40, it's only good for 6 months. So the reason I put that on here, here's for private pilot operations, a second class medical certificate issued to a 42-year-old pilot on July 15th this year will expire at midnight on July 15th, 2 years later. No. July 31st, 1 year later. No. July 31st, 2 years later. So here you can see the second class medical is only good for a year, but then it becomes a third class medical. Okay, so that's why it's 2 years later on that. So I know it's unfair. During your actual exam for your FAA oral or practical flying test, they won't ask you any of this stuff, but just get through the written. Okay. So, and there could be some questions about basic med on there. So I threw this quickly in here. What do I need to do to fly under basic med? Which is comply with the general basic med requirements, basically possess a U.S. driver's license, or if held a medical after July 14th of 2006, get a physical exam with a state licensed physician using the comprehensive medical examination checklist, complete a basic medical education course, then you can just go fly. So what do I need to maintain my basic med privileges? Here's the important part of this. Be sure you have a CMEC, which is this comprehensive medical examination checklist that shows your most recent physical examination was within the past 48 months, so 4 years. Be sure you are being treated by a physician for medical conditions that can affect the safety of flight. Be sure you have a course completion certificate that was issued by an approved medical training course provider within the past 24 calendar months. So there's 2 dates to remember here. Every 4 years you get your examination, and take the online course every 2 years. And here's the question. To maintain basic med privileges, you are required to complete the comprehensive medical examination checklist every, and it should be 48 months. There's that. All right, so next week we're going to get into our last class, navigation and national airspace